Hello everyone, this is Pam Haney. I wanted to provide you with an orientation to the coding steps that we use in ICD-10 CM. So in order to code correctly, it's so important that we understand the coding steps and the conventions of ICD-10 CM. We need to have specific written diagnoses to code. So in other words, we need the documentation. We never assume in coding. And when we code, always remember to use the alphabetic index as well as the tabular list. So I'd like you to take out your ICD-10 CM book and have it with you as we go through this presentation. As I mentioned, we have to have documentation. You may have heard, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. And that's absolutely true. So for us, when we're coding, we need to have pieces of information that are pertinent to the care of the patient. When we're coding for inpatients, the first piece of information is called the face sheet. Now, in electronic records, it may be called demographic information. If it's a paper record, it's called a face sheet. That's just where the patient information is documented. So we have the name of the patient, the gender, the admission and discharge dates, the discharge disposition, the insurance, a lot of key information, the age of the patient. That's all important because as we start to code, we need to build the story of the patient, and it helps us to understand the patient that we're coding for. Now in outpatients, we have something called the encounter form, right? Outpatients is a much shorter stay. It's usually just one day data service, or the patient may stay overnight in an observation status, for example. An encounter form, same thing, collects the demographic information. So become familiar with your patient. In an outpatient setting, for example, in a physician's office, there may be a problem list. That's an ongoing list of patient issues that the physician develops to make sure that they're addressing all of the patient's conditions. If they're acute conditions, they are typically resolved, or they may be chronic conditions that will be revisited every time the physician sees the patient. We also may see test results. Now, in certain situations, we can use those test results, such as an outpatient setting, when that test result has been interpreted and authenticated by the physician. In an inpatient setting, those test results provide clues for us coding, but we can only use the attending physician or other healthcare professionals' documentation and not code from test results. We may see an operative report if there was a procedure performed, and then certainly a discharge summary on the inpatient side, as well as some progress notes or a final note from the physician. So some things to keep in mind. As I mentioned, when we look at those test results, it can either confirm a diagnosis or give us clues as to what else is going on with that patient. And remember, we can only code from outpatient results that have been interpreted. So, for example, if the patient goes to the lab and we had a CBC and we have a CBC report, that has not been interpreted and authenticated by a physician. But if the patient has a radiology exam and the radiology report has been interpreted and signed by the radiologist, we can use that information in the outpatient setting. In the inpatient setting, we need to have the attending physician describe those conditions. And we'll talk more about that in another video that I'll do on our coding guidelines. Now, if there's conflicting information in the medical record, we have a process called query, and that is simply asking the physician for clarification. I'm also going to do a separate video on queries because there are right ways to query and there are incorrect ways to query the physician. And also your organization may have some specific coding policies about if we can code before those test results are received, or we need to hold off on releasing that claim until the results have been received. An example might be if the patient had surgery and there was a specimen sent to the pathology lab. There are some policies that say we can code from the operative report, and then other organizations say we will not code that claim until we have the pathology report back. Now, ICD-10-CM provided greater specificity in codes. So that means as coders, we need to have a high attention to detail in order to select the correct code. Now, we also, one of the responsibilities of coders is to also give feedback to our physicians. So if we're seeing physicians that are giving us non-specific codes or non-specific diagnoses, and we see that there may be additional information in the chart, that's a time to provide feedback or education to our physicians on what we need documented so that the patient's condition can be accurately reflected. Laterality is another new concept that was provided in ICD-10-CM. So if there are procedures performed on paired body parts or anatomic sites, we need to ensure that we identify which body part is covered. And you see some examples here. Unspecified fracture of unspecified femur. That means it's not documented. Now, maybe we would query the physician in some instances. If not, we would use an unspecified code. The more specific code, the greater granularity, would be identifying whether it's the right femur, S72.91, or the left femur, S72.92. Now, also, in some cases, especially in our chapter of musculoskeletal, we have a seventh character that describes episode of care. Okay, that's initial, subsequent, or sequela. Initial would be if something had first happened, and that's the initial episode of care. Subsequent would be follow-up, and sequela would be like a late effect. So if a patient has a fracture, it heals, and then they come back because of something that's happened to that old fracture. Now, we have a seventh character that we need to use to describe that encounter. Now, if we have a 5-digit code, that seventh character must be in the 7th position. So the conventions in ICD-10-CM are to add a placeholder of X. So if we had a code 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say for an example, and we had to add a 7th character for the initial episode of care, we would have to add an X for the 6th character so that our episode of care character is in the 7th position. So let's talk about steps. Now, if you have your coding manual, I want you to turn in the front of your book, there are the official coding guidelines. I want you to turn to the very last page of those official coding guidelines. It's the page before the alphabetic index to diseases and injuries. And you're going to see here are your coding steps. So even if you don't have this presentation, know that in your book, those coding steps are outlined for you. So the very first thing we're going to do is identify the main term. This is probably an area where a lot of students struggle. Think about the focus of treatment. What is the focus of the patient's visit for services? So when we look at the statement, acute allergic sinusitis, that's the diagnostic statement, our main term is sinusitis, right? Acute is just simply describing the type of condition, right? It's allergic, that's a descriptor, but the underlying reason the patient is seeking care is because of that sinusitis. Step 2, so we're going to look in our index. So if you have your book, I want you to turn in your alphabetic index to sinusitis. In the alphabetic index. Okay, now what I want you to do is you're going to see some instructional notations and you're going to see some non-essential modifiers. Now, those non-essential modifiers in this example just modify the main term. That means they are extra words to help you ensure you're in the right place. So under the term sinusitis in your index, you're going to see accessory, chronic, hyperplastic, nasal, non-purulent, or purulent. Now, these non-essential modifiers do not have to be present in our diagnostic statement, but they just give you more information. All right, so in our diagnostic statement from the physician, acute allergic sinusitis, the modifying terms are acute allergic. So when we're in our index under sinusitis, we're going to go down underneath the term sinusitis, and indented, we're going to see the term acute. All right, now we also have another term, allergic. And so what we see is when we look under acute, we don't see our additional term allergic. So that's not right. But when we look under allergic, there is our instructional notation that tells us, see rhinitis, allergic. So now in our index, we're going to turn to rhinitis in our alphabetic index. And under rhinitis, you're going to see in parentheses, there's lots of non-essential modifiers here, but we're going to go down to the term allergic. Now, we don't have any other information here, so the best that we can do is code J30.9. Okay, now we're not done. Okay, we saw those cross-reference notes, we saw the instructional notations, right, to get us to rhinitis. Now we have to confirm the code in the tabular list. So let's turn to J30.9 in the tabular section. J30.9. And a couple of things here I want to point out. We see J30.9 says allergic rhinitis unspecified. Okay, so we have nothing else in our diagnostic statement, so that's the best code. Now, I also want you to look under the 3-digit category above that at J30. Whenever we're coding, it's very important that we go back to the 3-digit category to see if there are any other instructional notations. We see includes notes, right? This is an instructional notation, spasmodic rhinorrhea, and we also see excludes 1 notes. Allergic rhinitis with asthma. So that's telling us we cannot code that there. Okay? So always look there to see information. Now, if you look below to code J31, I know this isn't our right code, but you're going to see more instructional notations. It says use additional code to identify, and you'll see some codes listed here. Always be sure you read around your code to see if any of those instructional notations apply. So as I mentioned, we're going to look for any instructional notations. There's nothing here that affects what we're coding, so we would select J30.9 as our final code. So let's do a little bit review about main terms, because this is an area, if you don't have the main term, it's going to really hinder you in finding the correct code. So in the diagnostic statement, compound fracture of the left tibia, I want you to think about what would be the main term. So pause this presentation and think about what would be the main term. Where would you start to look in your index? That's our first step. So in this statement, our main term, where we would start, would be the term fracture. Because the fracture is what is bringing the patient in for treatment, right? The term compound is just telling us the type of fracture, and the left tibia is just our anatomical location of where that fracture is. But it's the fracture that's the focus of treatment. All right, let's look at another one. How about acute reticulosis of infancy? So once again, pause this presentation and think about what would be the main term. What is the focus of treatment for this diagnostic statement? For this case, again, the focus would be the reticulosis, right? The acute is simply a descriptor of that diagnosis, and it's telling us it's happening in an infant. So reticulosis would be the focus of treatment. All right, here's another one. Ulcerative esophagitis with bleeding. Think about what would be bringing the patient in for treatment. What is the focus of treatment? In this case, what brought the patient in is the esophagitis. Ulcerative is, again, a descriptor of that esophagitis. And with the bleeding, it's just giving us a little more information, right? Those are modifying terms that describe the condition. So hopefully that was helpful. And in summary, I want you to think about, always start in the alphabetic index with your main term. Read all of your instructional notations. Then make sure that you verify your code in the tabular list. ICD-10 requires a high level of specificity. You need to read not only that medical record documentation carefully, but also your code descriptions. Make sure you go to the 3-digit category, see if there are any instructional notations or any additional information that you need before you assign your code. And then if you need additional clarification, you can query the physician. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful.